Oh. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me today. I wanted to take some time to chat a little bit about our public hearing that's going to be coming up this Wednesday in relation to some grade assessments that we've been talking about, as well as a few other changes along the West LRT route. So this is my first time doing a full live stream on YouTube, so we have like this room full of people. Actually, we have two other people who are joining me in the room who are going to be hopefully feeding me some of your questions and comments, just making sure it's actually running the way it's supposed to. I think it will, but bear with us as we work through this. So, as mentioned, we have a meeting coming up on March 21st. That's this Wednesday, and the public hearing is scheduled to run from 9:30 in the morning until 5:30 in the evening. That will obviously be a bit dependent on how many people register to speak, and everyone is welcome to either just attend or, if you'd like, come out and actually speak to the item. We're actually in the comments going to post a link to the meeting agenda. So if you're interested, you can read along while we're doing this live stream, but then you can also take some time to read it separately. If you think of any questions that you want to share with me, either while we're in the middle of this live stream, you can post them in the comments below, or if you just rather email or call me afterwards, you're more than welcome to do that. So I thought how I'd handle today is talk a little bit about some of the points along the West LRT route. We're not going to review everything. While we set aside some time today, we do not have enough time to go through absolutely everything. So I wanted to focus my attention on the actual terminus point at the Lewis Farms Transit Center, the grade separation conversation at 178th Street and 87th Avenue, the transit center, if you will, and the stop that's going to be at 156th Street and Stony Plain Road, and then finally 149th Street and Stony Plain Road, the grade separation, and that's the one that's got a lot of attention over the last couple of weeks, but there's a lot to talk about, and it's not just going to be focused on that one intersection. So really, I thought we'll get started. I've got with me some of the notes of the agenda that we're going to be discussing, along with I've already been drafting a long list of questions for this to make sure I know what I want to be asking about at Wednesday's public hearing. So you'll see me occasionally glance over to my iPad from time to time, just to sort of review some of the questions that I've been jotting down. I spent most of yesterday reading that report, and since it's such a big decision, I wanted to take the time and put that in. So with that in mind, let's get started. I thought we'd start a little bit around the Lewis Farms Transit Center. This one, I think, generally is a smaller change overall, but it's still an important one to talk about. And I should add one note in advance of all of this. While I'll be sharing some of my thoughts and comments right now, these are really my preliminary thoughts and comments. I've reviewed the agenda thoroughly a couple of times now. I have a lot of questions, but the whole point of the public hearing is to also hear from anyone who's interested to share their additional comments or ask their questions that we can then ask on their behalf. So while I'll have, these are sort of my initial thoughts on these areas, those are subject to change based off the information that comes forward during the public hearing, during that discussion, during the questions of our administration, but I thought it'd be good to give you a better idea of where I'm at. So the Lewis Farms Transit Center, the idea originally in the first plan when it was approved years ago was to actually have a smaller park and ride than is even there today. The thinking was that they were going to put about a 275 parking stall park and ride location, and the LRT would stop a little closer to that than it would the actual transit center as we know where it is right now. In the new recommended changes, the idea is to actually change this over to a 900-car parking stall or a park and ride facility, and have the LRT stop actually in between, so right beside the transit center as we know it today, and it'll be connected to some of the vehicle parking, but obviously with such a large park and ride, there will be some that have to walk a little bit further. On paper, for me, I like what I've seen in that change. I think it's important both to have a larger park and ride at that location, It's our starting point for anyone jumping on the West LRT, and I think it'd be good to have that. At the same time, I like the fact that the West LRT, actually in the LRT itself, is going to be stopping right beside the transit center. I think that's an important piece when we're thinking about that transition for a lot of people who will be using transit exclusively, for them to be able to walk off the bus and jump right onto LRT and vice versa. That's a better design principle than having it much further away and then having to have a lot of foot traffic go back and forth. So there are a couple of considerations, things we'll need to talk about, because this new change does look like it changes the neighborhood structure plan a little bit. And I want to compare that to what was originally planned for that parcel of land. In the original neighborhood structure plan, that area was identified as what's called a special study area. And I do know that residents who have lived in the Potter Green section for some time had a different idea of what might be there. I think the neighborhood structure plan may or may not be set up to create more of a transit-oriented development space. So part of this conversation is, how long would a larger park and ride stay there? At what point do we want to see a shift over to that transit-oriented development? So we'll play, we'll follow that one closely. I'll have some questions. I already have a list of them ready to go. But generally speaking, I do support a larger park and ride there. I think a lot of the residents in Secord, Rosenthal, Lewis Estates, and then beyond, even further north in the Big Lake communities and further south, there's going to be a benefit to that larger space. So what I'll do is, as I'm talking about these, if you have questions about that particular spot, feel free to throw them in the comments below. I'll be pulling them up as I can and hopefully can respond to them. If there are no questions about that particular section, or if they come up later, we can always come back to it. But if I don't have anything specific to that one section, I'll just move on to the next section, just so we can make sure we get to each location in the appropriate amount of time. And that's part of why we have a team here today to manage the comments and all of this. Normally I'd probably keep that on my iPad, but I also have a lot of our LRT notes today, and so as they come in, they'll be held up behind me there, or rather in front of me, behind you, the viewer. And then we'll keep going. So from here, I'm going to jump over, if there are no questions, to 178th Street and 87th Avenue. So the recommended change for that location is to actually separate the LRT from traffic, have the LRT go above that intersection and then come down after 178th Street. Again, you may recall that in the original plan, the LRT would start going up. If we were traveling west on the LRT, it would start going up in advance of the Misericordia Hospital. The LRT station would be above ground at the Misericordia. It would go above 170th Street. There would be an elevated station at West Edmonton Mall. And then the idea in the original plan was to have that LRT go down to street level before 178th Street. So we will, with the new recommendation, the idea is to hang that LRT above ground for a few extra 100 meters, if you will, to get over top of 178th Street before coming down. So this one, I think, generally, I have heard almost unanimous support on. I think most people see there's a lot of value here, especially because the LRT is already above ground at the West Edmonton Mall stop. And so the additional cost to stay above ground is not as much as a standalone grade separation, which we'll discuss a little bit later, like at 149th Street and Stony Plain Road. So for me, I think generally I'm very supportive of this. I think the administration's recommendation is good. I do have a question around the version of the recommendation they've put forward. So if you have a chance to read through the report and the attachments, in that report, each attachment breaks down each of these sections. But you'll note that in the actual report, there's two versions of the LRT going above ground that are being compared. One of which is to have the LRT from the West Edmonton Mall station, make it all the way to the south side of 87th Avenue, and then continue along the south side and then go down after 178th Street. versus having the LRT first come to the middle of 87th Avenue, cross 178th Street, and then go across and then down afterwards on the south side of 87th Avenue. So what you'll notice in the report, and this is the part I want to learn more about, is that in the report they actually say, and these two options are very comparable, but it sounds like the way I read the report, the option of the LRT coming to the median of 87th Avenue before going to the south side is actually marginally better in their ranking system. But and I should note also, according to the report, $10 million cheaper, so around $70 million versus the $80 million option, which is to go immediately to the south side of 87th Avenue. So the recommendation is to be right on the south side of 87th Avenue. I'd like to understand why the median option isn't the one that's being recommended, especially because it's A, $10 million less according to the report, and B, as they note in the report, there are some potential better urban design principles to be thought about at that location. So I think generally speaking it's important that we have grade separation there. I think it's much easier to justify the cost of that grade separation since the LRT is already above ground. And so I think outside of a handful of people that I've spoken with, the vast majority have said this is a location where it's important to invest that money up front. But those are going to be some of the questions that I ask about. So I did see one question come in. So the one question that had come in is, will the park and ride be monetized, pay-per-use, or monthly passes are free? It is likely to be a paid park and ride as well, like with many of our other locations. As to the exact ratio of paid stalls versus free stalls, that's still to be determined. I can't remember exactly the date, but there had been a discussion a while back around all of our park and rides and being able to do up to 75% of the stalls as paid, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every location that has park and ride has all 75% go to paid. So again, I think there will be some work to determine exactly what that right ratio is. We'll have to see the demand. I expect it would be quite high in that location, and so something for us to consider. But yeah, I would expect you will see probably, and again, I'm just sort of making an estimate myself, but I would imagine that likely at least 50% of your stalls there are going to be paid, being that even with 900 stalls and a significant increase over what was planned, I imagine it's going to be quite popular for a lot of people to park and ride there, and so you have to try and find that balance. So from there, we will look. We'll see if there are any other questions on the 178th Street, 87th Avenue. I figured not. Most people seem pretty unanimous in that comments in that section. So. I did want to move, before we get to the one that I think most people want to chat about, which is 149th Street and Stony Plain Road, I did want to spend a bit more time on the Jasper Place Transit Center, the 156th Street stop right off Stony Plain Road. So in the original plan for that route, the idea was to take the LRT and have it come in at a 45-degree angle on what would be the I guess the southeast corner of 156th Street and Stony Plain Road. And part of that was that the idea was they were also going to take the Jasper Place Transit Center and move it to that side of the street, so you'd be able to transition everyone off the bus right onto the LRT right at that corner. The other benefit at the time was, of course, that by doing a 45-degree angle turn, it's a little less sharp. There is always some level of noise when you're doing more sharp turns, and obviously it's a little bit dependent upon speed. But that was one way to potentially mitigate some of that concern. The new recommendation is to actually have the LRT do a 90-degree turn at 156th Street and Stony Plain Road and actually have the station on the west side of 156th Street. And so this is a big change, and there's a couple of reasons behind that. And again, there will be, I'm sure, a lot of conversation about this particular one because there are pros and cons to both options, and it's something we'll have to think quite hard about. By keeping it where it was originally planned, again, I talked a little bit about the pros and cons there. One other probably big positive to that particular version would be the turning movements at the intersection of 156th Street and Stony Plain Road. There'd probably be more turning movements that would be able to be maintained. One of the concerns I have heard raised, particularly from residents of West Jasper Place, but would be potentially relevant to anyone south of Stony Plain Road, is that you would, if the new recommended option is approved, to be able to turn left onto Stony Plain Road if you're traveling northbound on 156th Street. That would no longer be the case. So that's obviously an important factor for those who are driving. And the question would be are there going to be parallel roadways nearby where that turning movement would still be allowed? As an example, could you still make that turn at 100th Avenue and on 156th Street if you allowed it further at 102nd Avenue, which is one of the initial suggestions, that you might have a full signalized intersection there? That's something that we need to talk about. So on the other hand, some people ask, well, if that's the downside, what are some of the upsides of potentially moving this station, and why is the administration recommending it? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of probably the biggest one is that since Jasper Place Transit Center is now going to be staying on the west side of 156th Street, anyone who lives in that area or is driven by has seen that area is under construction. That is where the terminal is going to stay for all the bus traffic. It turns out that there wasn't really enough space to have all of the buses come in at that angled stop, and so they felt it was right to keep it there to make sure all the buses could come in. So with that in mind, if you have potentially hundreds of people who want to transfer either from the bus onto the LRT or from the LRT onto the bus system, if the LRT station is on the other side of 156th Street at that angled location like originally proposed, what that would mean is that you would have potentially hundreds of people who regularly need to cross 156th Street. And so one of the questions would come up is that are those intersections designed to handle that level of foot traffic? What does that do to the traffic that's trying to drive? How long do those signals need to be changed to ensure that that many people can flow through? So it's a really big consideration around being able to have hundreds of people be able to transition from one to the other. So that's one of the big reasons for it. The other one, and I think it's important to think about in this conversation, is actually the Orange Hub and the parking lot, the parking structure right joined with the Orange Hub. For those of you who are unaware, the Orange Hub is actually the old McEwen building. So that is that, we all know that color, it's that you know, I don't even know how to describe that color of orange, but it's there. And we know it right on the corner of 100th Avenue and 156th Street. So they have a parking structure right now that allows people who are using that facility to come in, park, and take part in the services or any of the events or programs that are going to be run there. If we went with the originally approved plan of having it angled at 156th Street, then what ends up happening is that parking structure actually has to be removed. So again, that's an important consideration, which is that if you're losing that parking structure, what does that do for all of the tenants who are operating out of the Orange Hub? And the whole point of the Orange Hub is it's meant to be a community amenity space now, where you have non-for-profits, you have arts and cultural organizations operating out of this new space. If you no longer have that parking, does that push parking for that facility onto the side streets, potentially into some of the neighboring communities? That's something to think about. And I'll add one more, and this isn't part of the original plan, but it's something I'd like the city to think about, is that if you had that parking structure, and if you were going to potentially think about even improving on it, could that become a mini park and ride location? There aren't any like that planned, you know, sort of interior to the community or interior to the route. If you retain that parking structure, does that open up an opportunity to have people park and ride? I'm not sure, and I think there would have to be some conversation around, you know, do you build that up a little bit more to have that? So that's something that we'll chat about there. One final consideration that was noted in the report is that by doing that, by making that move, they do feel that there are more opportunities for transit-oriented development, just based off how the system would come in and operate and connect with the adjacent roadways. So there will be lots to talk about on that. I can see benefits to both options. I've heard from members of different communities with different thoughts on that. I've heard a lot from the community of West Jasper Place. I was out at Kenora for their annual general meeting just last night, and I think it's going to be a tough one, because I actually think that one has fairly conflicting views, at least through the conversations I've had to date. Now, I'm just going to double check my messages, because there might be another comment. Oh, no, it sounds like the original comment might have been resolved there. So we're good to go. We will keep it moving. Oh, and I should note, with that option, cost-wise, it sounds like they're going to be the same. The difference for going to one or the other sounds to be like we're pretty much netting out to be similar, I think. Other than, because we're leaving the Jasper Place terminal as is, that's obviously a benefit. We're not talking about having to suddenly then, after rebuilding the Jasper Place Transit Center, having some buses come over to the east side if that's there. But let's talk about the big one that everyone's been talking about. Lots of news coverage over the last little while. I've received so many questions on it and a lot of feedback. And my apologies if I haven't responded to your message yet. I am working my way through, but it has been a fairly, this is one of the few times I've started to feel a bit overwhelmed with the amount of correspondence I've got. So I'm about 3 to 4 days behind right now on my emails, and I'm trying to make it through. But after this live stream, I get to go into a public hearing that could last all the way to 9:30 tonight, and then Tuesday we go into a city council meeting scheduled throughout the entire day, and then I think there's even an evening meeting scheduled. So being realistic, if you've sent me an email over the last 3 days and I haven't got to you yet, I might not be able to reach out to you just in advance of that meeting. As I always do, I will commit to responding to everything. That's part of why I wanted to do this live stream, so we could also just send this to people in case they didn't get a chance to watch this live while we're doing this now. I can send it to them after the fact. But let's go to Stony Plain Road and 149th Street. So a bit of history on this. When we first started the conversation for this this intersection, again, I won't delve much into the history. The decision on the route was made back in 2009. The idea was that the LRT would operate at grade at this intersection. And when I say at grade, I'm talking street level. And there were a lot of good reasons for that decision originally being made. Of course, cost being one of the biggest factors, the other being the low-floor LRT. There's two other big ones. The low-floor LRT is meant to integrate better with the streets to really create this vibrant main street where people would go to enjoy. And then the final consideration, and this is something that for any number of reasons still seems to not be known as well as it should be, which is that the city is using a low-floor LRT for the Valley Line, which operates very, very differently from the existing LRT system. So forgive me while I have a quick glass of water. This is great for video. Good, we got a bit of laughter in the background and everything. So, the low-floor LRT, the whole design behind this is that as it comes up to some of these busiest intersections, it gets what's called partial priority over the traffic signals. So think about our existing LRT and where you've ran into challenges at certain intersections. It's because as that LRT comes in, it gets full priority over some of those overall intersections. And where you have seen some traffic challenges, that's typically the case because the LRT gets full priority and it stops the traffic, and so it gets to go through. What a partial priority system does what it means is that if that LRT were coming up to an intersection like Stony Plain Road and 149th Street, and the traffic signal for the east-west traffic was red, it would actually stop at that intersection. It doesn't get to preempt that traffic signal, turn it green, and stop the north-south traffic flow. The only thing it would do under the partial priority idea is that if it were approaching that intersection and the light was currently green, but maybe it was going to go red in about 5 seconds and it's 10 seconds away, it can hold that for a few extra seconds so it can make it through that intersection, and then the light will change. So that's important consideration for this discussion, because that's one of the key reasons why the LRT was never planned to do, why there was no plan to do a lot of grade separation. Really, the only plan when this plan was first approved was at 170th Street at 87th Avenue. So the decision was made, no, that there doesn't need to be grade separation at the location because it gets that partial priority. That said, about a year ago, we did have a conversation and say, you know what, we should still look into at least get a detailed analysis of that intersection and a number of other intersections along the route. The thinking behind that is that, you know, we have heard obviously challenges in other parts of the city and frustration from other people and saying, well, you know, is that going to happen here? And yes, even though it's a different style of LRT and we shouldn't be seeing that at all, what I think was important is for us to have a detailed analysis, to have all of that information available, to have this public meeting that we're going to be having on Wednesday before we send the project out to tender and actually make that final commitment. So where we're at today, and I'll give a bit of history on that, is that when this first came forward, I think there were really two considerations beyond keeping it as originally approved, which is, again, just a street level crossing. In the two new options that were being discussed, it was, well, let's take the LRT and put it above 149th Street, or let's take the LRT and put it below 149th Street. Those are sort of the two key ideas that were being considered separate as part of this grade separation assessment. Partway through that process, there was a third option that came up for grade separation. That was, well, what if you took the roadway of 149th Street and put that underneath Stony Plain Road? You could leave the LRT at street level, you have the roadway as sort of a free flow, and what would that look like? So let's analyze that as well. So on paper, actually, sharing my thoughts, is that originally I thought that made the most sense, because it lets us have the benefits of street level LRT, that low floor LRT. It would have potentially helped address some of the traffic impact concerns. But then it raises the question of, okay, well, what does that look like? What does that cost? How much impact is that actually going to have? And as we started going through, and as a detailed analysis of that option was underway, a fourth option came forward, actually, and this is from the Stony Plain Road Business Improvement Area. So for those of you who are unaware, most of our main streets, so in our case, Stony Plain Road has a board that's there to help provide advice and help just work in a sort of ongoing revitalization of a number of these locations. So the Stony Plain Road Business Improvement Area had suggested the idea, what if we took Stony Plain Road west of 149th Street and turned it into a one-way road? And the thinking behind that, if for anyone who lives in the West End, as you probably know now, most of the eastbound traffic that's coming from the west end of the city into the core, most of us use 100th Avenue. That is by far and away the major traffic route for eastbound traffic. And so the idea was saying, well, if you're turning that solely into a westbound only lane west of 149th Street, that frees up one traffic movement and would potentially allow you to adjust your traffic signal timing for the remaining traffic movements. So this option also came on the table, and I actually asked our administration as part of the review and as part of the report to do a high-level analysis on this as well. This came very late in the process, and so that's why if you go through that report, you're going to notice there's not quite as much detail on that option as there are some of the other ones. But I wanted to give you all of that so that you have a better idea of what's being considered for Wednesday. Now, the big change, and this isn't so much a change, but the big piece that sort of has come up is with the road underpass option, which is now the recommended change in the plan. Instead of keeping the LRT at street level, the recommendation that's come forward is to put the 149th Street road underneath. To construct that underpass, if you've had a chance to see the report or see a lot of the news stories, what you've seen is that it actually would require a fair amount of property, particularly along the western side of 149th Street. So What that does is a lot of the Jasper Gate shopping center as we know it today, so anyone who knows that area, there's quite a few businesses along there. On that side of Stony Plain Road. On the other, there's a number of other businesses, even a 3-story residential apartment building just up by 102nd Avenue. It is likely that all of those properties would need to be acquired to develop that underpass. So, sorry, it's great video. I know every time I drink water, but I'm talking a lot. So the challenge when I saw this is that, to me, it sort of defeats the purpose of what we're going for when we talk about a low-floor urban-style LRT. And I have a lot of concerns with the idea that the notion that we should, that we could potentially lose all of those locations simply to have a road go underneath. And particularly why I have those concerns comes back to the actual analysis that's occurred. It's one thing to say, yeah, it's not great to lose that, but what if it saves 10 or 15 minutes? How much of an impact is this actually going to have? And that's the part that's quite fascinating. If you go in through the document, you're going to actually see the numbers here. So, as an example, probably the most impactful area is for anyone that's traveling westbound on Stony Plain Road that wants to make a left-hand turn onto 149th Street. So on opening day, if there's no LRT, right now there's about a 16-second delay, just as a point of reference. 30 years from now, if we have the LRT at grade, that delay goes from about 16 seconds up to 99 seconds. And what's important to note is that even if we do the underpass option, that delay goes from 16 seconds to 46 seconds. And of course, this is at a cost of $160 million. And for me, that's one of the most important pieces of this, which is that when we're talking about making sure we do what we can to mitigate impact to those that are going to continue to drive, because some are going to take the LRT, but some may still need to drive for work. I've heard from them as well. But really hard to justify spending that much money on one specific intersection to have what I feel is a fairly minimal impact on traffic time. For me, it seems counterintuitive to the whole purpose of revitalization of Stony Plain Road by taking away all of those businesses that many community residents rely on each and every day, and really for the added benefit for the cost, it seems to be too much for what we would actually experience. So that's a little bit of where I'm at right now. For me, I would much prefer, I think, where we're at today, and of course all of this, as mentioned earlier, is going to be dependent upon both the discussion that takes place at the public hearing, and want to get some additional feedback that may help inform additional questions or comments. But on paper, I like the idea of keeping it at grade, but specifically, I would like to dig into the conversation around that one-way option. It was explored at a high level in the report. I actually think there's a lot of potential under that one-way option to help the revitalization efforts of Stony Plain Road even more. What would be interesting about it, and you should take an opportunity to read through that report if you haven't and go look at the option, but they presented two options, and option 2 of the one-way option would have the lane of traffic, and then it would have a parking lane. But on top of that, with the way it's designed, you would have much wider sidewalks than even under the original at-grade plan. So you'd have these wide pedestrian walkways. You'd have the LRT running, you would have your westbound traffic lane, you would have a parking lane that can be used parking throughout most of the day, but I also think about the potential of that parking when it gets busier. So what about in the early evening during dinner time when we have people in new restaurants setting up on Stony Plain Road? What if you could then have those restaurants expand out onto that widened sidewalk, put a wonderful cafe or restaurant extension, have the seats and tables and chairs there, and then use that parking lane as sort of an extended walkway. You see it a little bit on White Ave right now during some of the busiest times. Some of those restaurants come out and then the sidewalk actually gets pushed out and they sort of walk around it. Why couldn't we do that for Stony Plain Road? And I actually think this one-way option opens up a pretty unique opportunity. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about that, and this is going to be factoring in cost, traffic impact. I'm certain a lot of people are going to be speaking about this. A lot of the feedback I've heard over the last couple of weeks, particularly from residents in and around that area, have a lot of concerns with doing the road underpass. And I'm expecting a lot of them will come to actually speak about that item. But I wanted to give you an idea of where I'm at on that as of right now. But again, I also want to get your feedback on that too. For me, it's one thing to have some of these opinions right now, but I want your feedback, your ideas, your suggestions on not just this location, but any of these locations along the way. I do think a few questions have come in, so I want to make sure I jump into that. I think one had come from Roxanne around, just raised a comment around low floor systems being slower than the existing LRT. And that's actually true. The low floor LRT is designed to operate more at traffic speeds, so 50 to 60 kilometers an hour, moving with the flow of traffic versus having a completely separated right-of-way. It's a very different system than before, and again, that was a decision made in, I think it was about 2008, by the Council of the Day to shift to that model, because this low floor system, while it will still move people quickly, it might not be quite as quick as what you would have with a high floor system, but it also opens up a lot of opportunities for redevelopment. It really helps the revitalization efforts of a number of those locations along the LRT route. And so there's a lot of potential in this, and I think, you know, while we've talked about partial priority a little bit at the beginning, at all of the less busy intersections, that LRT will get full priority. So we're still talking that, you know, even in the and sort of, if you're starting at Lewis Farms, working your way into downtown, you're probably talking at the very most around 33 minutes or so. Well, I mean, those of you know where I live, I'm just over by Jasper Place Library, and while I don't drive often into City Hall in the morning, when I do, I mean, even just driving from my home during rush hour, it's typically 25 minutes just from there. And excuse me, everyone. So I think when you're comparing it to the drive time, it's still going to be better for anyone driving, or who's sort of on the fence to say, hey, you know what, I'm thinking about maybe doing a park and ride, but if I can't get there much quicker, or if I, why would I do it? I think you're going to see a speed improvement. You won't have to, of course, deal with parking constraints or issues like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of benefit to the low floor style of LRT, and I'm pretty excited about it. I think speed is still an important consideration, and frankly, that's part of why I take a spot like 178th Street at 87th Avenue. I think it's worth spending the money at that intersection because it's a much smaller amount than, say, this intersection at 149th Street, to provide one less intersection where the LRT would have just had partial priority. Now, if you're going above that intersection, your travel time potentially just drop down and even another little bit, because you wouldn't be stopping at that light. So just wanted to make sure you had that. I had a question from Tim. Does any solution take away businesses and walkability? Call into question why we are building low floor LRT. If it's about walkability, why is it even considered? Yeah, and I think, and again, part of why any of these grade separations were explored in the first place is because we asked them to explore. Council did, and in fact, those of you who followed my campaign know that I campaigned fairly heavily on grade separations at both 178th Street and 149th Street. And so it's something I'm aware of, that what I've just talked about goes against what I was thinking I wanted to do during the campaign. But now that I have these hard numbers and the costs, I think there's a strong case to be made to not spending the money at that location. And I think you've raised an important point around what does that do if you build this road underpass at 149th Street for people to be able to access that location. If you're on the other side of 149th Street, how do you easily get across to go access whatever remaining businesses would be there around 149 on the other side of 149th Street? So I think there's that's one of the strong reasons. Whereas a spot like 178th Street, we're not losing any of that, right? And in fact, I think, as you'll see in the report, there might even be some opportunities to, especially if we do the median option on 87th Avenue, to make sure there's some enhanced walkway options. But yeah, I think again, this is on council because we were the ones that asked for it, and again, I'm the first to say I was the one wanting to ask for this. I felt it was really important. I got that question a lot during the campaign, and now that we have the detailed analysis, I feel a lot better around being able to come back and say, you know, even though I campaigned on this specific action at that intersection, I think there's a better way to do it. You know, I don't want to dig too much into that right now, but just in case you haven't seen, a few weeks ago I put forward a motion to examine the idea of artificially intelligent smart traffic signals. And part of why I raised this is that I've been seeing in Pittsburgh they're using these new AI-enabled traffic signals. Actually, they've been using it since about 2012. And where they've been using it, they've seen actually a 40% reduction in vehicle wait time, 25% reduction in vehicle travel time. And so one of the questions I'm posing is that, well, if we're worried about traffic flow, is $160 million at that one intersection the right approach? Or should we say, well, what could we do with that kind of money when we talk about dealing with efficient movement of goods and people? Could that money be better used to upgrading intersections along a corridor to help save even more time? So just some things to think about when it comes to that, and that's part of what drives this. And so I would throw this out there that, yeah, I think walkability, I've said it in I think an article that's just released today too. It does feel like that's been a little bit of an afterthought in this discussion, and it's something I have some questions already written for Wednesday's discussion. As one example, something that's worth talking about is from how the system's supposed to be implemented. Right now, under the current rules, is that if you went from one corner to one corner, if there's no traffic lights there and you're walking, you're actually not supposed to be able to cross there anymore. And to me, I think the whole point of a low-floor urban-style LRT is to make it more walkable as well. And so I think we need to, whether it's provide direction or at least raise it at that meeting, say let's take that opportunity for people to go from one corner to the other without needing traffic lights at every location. Sure, it's important in some spots, but we allow it right now across the same routes where the LRT will be going. So why wouldn't we allow that for after the LRT comes in? Peter had a question. Do the delay studies take into account less traffic on Stony Plain Road after the 142nd and 149th Street change to one lane in each direction? So I'm pretty confident the answer is yes. There's an assumption that there's going to be a ridership built into that, but these are 30-year out numbers again, and so you know, I've even been the one to say, while I fully expect there will be a large ridership on the LRT, we are still a growing city. We're still going to see more people driving. Of course, we'll see how self-driving cars comes into all of this, but I'm going to ignore those for this particular moment and say, even 30 years out, we'll have to contend with the fact that there will still likely be more vehicle traffic, and we've got to be aware of that. But I'll confirm that at Wednesday's meeting. That's my understanding of how they design it. They both assume an increased ridership on LRT, but that's why we're using those 30-year out numbers. So I think I had some other ones sent to me, maybe through the Facebook page. Mm-hmm. Yes, okay, good. And a lot of fun pictures here that I'm going to pull up and see. So, yeah, I wasn't, and sorry, just as an advance, we were following on the YouTube comments, and I haven't been following as much on the Facebook side, but Rod had a question around the 90-degree turn on 156th Street will create a lot of problems. Traffic going north will have to turn at 95th to go west. We can't access Stony Plain Road and can't turn west for 7 blocks. So I did chat a little bit about that earlier, and that's so. But I'll expand on it. That's what I want to dig into because I want to know, and I have this question on my list already, is that with this proposed change, would that stop somebody from being able to turn left onto 100th Avenue? Because if not, then I think that potentially alleviates one of the major concerns. The other piece is in the original plan. If you go back to some of the old presentations back in even 2010, I pulled one up, and they identified that there might be a signalized intersection set up at 102nd Ave too, to consider. So that's part of the conversation I want to have on Wednesday. I think that's an important topic. We have to balance out the needs of the driving traffic with the needs of those who live in and around the area. So that one is particularly tough, but I think there's some opportunities to still try and provide opportunities for the driving traffic to go west. But we'll dig into that a little bit further at Wednesday's meeting. Let's keep going through. Again, sorry, this is great. This is great video right now. I think there had been a concern raised about was LRT being rushed through without receiving full information from administration. It'll be old technology, the suggestion is, in a few years. Why waste this money? Wait a few years and do a thorough job looking to new technology first. So great, thank you for bringing that up. And I realize we're at 12:45, but I'm going to go a little bit longer just to answer a little bit more here, and then we'll wrap up. But first, I guess I would, when it comes just to the consideration of the LRT and the information, that's actually the whole point of this Wednesday meeting. We asked for, while this item has been discussed now for, I've been involved since 2007, and it's been discussed long before I was involved, but sort of in its current iteration, it's really been since 2007. So to me, I don't feel this has been a short process. This has been one of the lengthiest processes the city has ever gone through. And even still, we asked for more information to get that level of detail to be able to have these informed conversations and make some informed decisions before we send the project out to tender. So that's one of the, I would note that generally, I think every piece of information we need, including what's going to come up on Wednesday, is enough for us to confidently make a decision. But I'm going to go into the other point around, is this going to be obsolete technology? And yeah, it's a fascinating discussion. For those of you who know, a number of years ago, I raised the idea on council around our need to be prepared for automated vehicles, otherwise referred to as autonomous or self-driving vehicles. Wanted to get this onto the council's radar because I think it is going to have a substantially huge impact on how we move as a city, and not just how we move, but how we build our city. So it's always been in the back of my mind, and in fact, we have a separate report coming back in June, independent of this conversation, because this conversation needs to happen regardless of the June conversation. But the point of the conversation in June and the report that's coming back in June is that analysis of those emerging transportation technologies. If you saw the original stories back in November when this motion came forward, I was highlighting a trackless train that's being used in China. So it looks like a low-floor LRT, but it really operates on rubber tires. So it has the capacity of LRT, has the speeds, it's even autonomous as well. So that's an idea. We saw the news story either yesterday or today around maglev technology and how that can impact it. So the whole point of June is to say, let's have that analysis. How far away are these? And really get a proper understanding, because I want to make sure we need mass transit out to the west end of the city. That's a given. I think most people generally understand that. Whether it's this low floor system like we know today, or this new trackless train, or something else, that's still something that we'll discuss in June before we send the project out to tender. The challenge, and I think, on a much smaller scale, we all typically go through that in our lives. I grabbed my phone a little bit earlier, and I think about, every year a new one of these is coming out. And at some point, you just have to, if you always wanted to wait for the newest because you knew something new is coming out, you'd actually never make a decision, because you'd always just say, well, I got to wait for the next one. Well, now I got to wait for the next one after that. Sooner or later, cities have to make a decision, right? And yeah, I think it's important that we've done our due diligence, and we have a report coming back to ensure that our due diligence is being completed. So I want to make sure you know that it's absolutely a consideration, and I'm not adverse to using new transportation technology to come out to the west. I just want to make sure we've made that right decision. Regardless of what technology we use, many of these same questions need to be resolved anyways, so Wednesday's discussion is still really critical, whether we were using a low-floor system today, or a maglev system, or again, a trackless train. All of that's still relevant in the conversation. But thank you for the questions, something we're very much considering here. Let me just see if there's anything else. I think We got it. Anything else? Perfect. I see you shaking heads. No. So it is 12:50. I've talked a lot. First of all, thank you for joining me live. For those of you that have, if you're watching this after the fact, so thank you for taking the time to watch it. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the comments section below this video. We'll also post it on my Facebook page so you can comment there. As mentioned, I want to be realistic. I've got a pretty packed schedule the next couple of days, and so I don't know if I'll be able to get to your questions in advance of Wednesday's meeting, but happy to receive them. I'll read them, and if there are questions that I need to ask of administration on Wednesday, I'll do that. As well, just your feedback. If you can't make it out to the public hearing Wednesday from 9:30 to 5:30, feel free to send me your thoughts in advance. Again, I won't likely respond in time for Wednesday, but I will make sure to commit to read through everything that comes in. You're welcome to join in person. You're welcome to watch online, and I hope you do take some time to be a part of this discussion. I know a lot of people already have, and thank you for the feedback I've been getting to date. I'll be doing videos like this in the future, so make sure I'm going to do the good old-fashioned YouTube. Subscribe now. Make sure I want to get the subscribers on the videos so that you can be aware of when we're doing new content. And other than that, I really just, again, thank you for being a part of this. Thanks. Hopefully the sound came through well. Hopefully it was all working well. This is my first YouTube live stream, but it's been a pleasure chatting with everyone, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everyone.